Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this, the third and last in our series of webinars on the major economic challenges, inspired by the review for President Macron in France, which published earlier this year. We've already looked at inequalities, and we've looked at climate change, and today we're looking at demographic change. And I'm delighted that we've got three of the authors of that report here today. We've got Axel Börsch-Supan, who is going to be talking about the aging dimension of the challenges from demographic change. Axel is director of the Max Planck Institute and professor in economics at the University of Munich. We will then have Carol Proper, who is a fellow here at the IFS, professor at the Imperial College, and she will be talking about health. And then Claudia Diehl, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Constance, and she'll be talking about migration. So the three big issues in demographic change: aging, health, and migration. They're going to speak for something like 10 minutes each. And then we'll have a quick response from James Banks, who is a colleague of mine here at the IFS, as well as being Professor of Economics at the University of Manchester. And finally, last but by no means least, Lucinda Platt, who is a colleague of mine on the Deaton Review of Inequalities and a Professor of Sociology and Social Policy at the London School of Economics. So I hope you'll agree that is a stunning lineup of expertise to be talking to us for the next 45 minutes or so. After they've spoken, then we will have plenty of time for questions. So please do put your questions into the Slido app and vote for questions that you like, because those are the ones that will float to the top of my screen. But with no further ado, I will leave it at that point and hand over to Axel.
So thanks, Paul, for the introduction. Let me share the slides right away. Okay, so to brush up your French a little bit, here's the title. We divide our work into three parts, as Paul already mentioned. I would speak about demography, but mainly actually about pensions. Carol will follow on health, and Claudia will finish with integration, which you will see these three things really belong together, and that is one of the topics which we'll go through all our presentation. To address demographic change, one needs a fairly holistic strategy, including health. And all those people who contribute less to the labor force. Let me actually start with the diagnosis, which has three parts. The first diagnosis is well known. This the population of France is aging, as all populations in Europe are. The aging process is not smooth, but very sudden. We will see the baby boom go into retirement following the next 5 years or so. And luckily, in most countries, maybe not in all, in Europe, we actually see an increase in life expectancy. So what is sure that there will be additional pension expenditures, healthcare expenditures, long-term care expenditures for the next decades, really in the long term. Just to put this a little bit into perspective, this is the old age dependency ratio, the number of 65 plus divided by the 15 to 64-year-olds. France is in the middle of the spectrum. You see the French demography is more threatening than in the UK, not to speak about the US, but much milder than in Germany, Italy, or Spain. That's important to keep in mind. Demography per se is an important driver, but not the most important driver of the pension problems and demography problems France has. So what is more important? Problem number 2 is the pension system itself. Look at the second point. It's extremely complex, and in the beginning I thought it's completely incomprehensible, and it's certainly perceived as unfair. I have to say, and for you this may be some pleasure, there are pension systems which are even more complex than the UK system. The other problem with the pension system is they tried to solve the French tried to solve the problem of cost increases by going all the way to price indexing. So pensions are given when you start retirement, and then in the development of pensions depends on the rate of inflation. Now, this has developed into a trap because this works only if there are large productivity gains. So the difference between inflation and between price and wage inflation is large. But exactly then it reduces quite heavily the relative living standard of very old pensioners, because they will suffer relative to wages the most. And there are complaints right now in the French system that it's already too much. That's why I call it a trap. Just again, to give you a little picture, this is the French system, and I stress that this is a simplified view. There are about 38 different systems for each sector, down to different sectors for the railway and the subway. Very, very detailed, completely fragmented, which also has a political side effect, makes it very hard to reform pension. But also, so this is the vertical dimension, but also horizontally, a lot of people actually have two pension systems. One is earnings related, the other is duration related, how long you stayed in the labor force, making for a very, very complicated calculation of your pension. And most people don't know what to expect of their pension. Another feature of the French pension system is the generosity. To the right side, you see the average income, equivalized disposable household income of retirees. And voila, it's more than 100% relative to the general population. So you actually get rich by retiring. If you compare it in blue here, you see the United Kingdom, much more frugal. Obviously, France, just because of the generosity, quickly gets a financial problem. The third point, the third problem area is the most important one, which is old age labor market. At age 60, before the earliest retirement age, less than 50% of French are working. Now, after that age, few continue to work. So you first see a very, very, very sudden transition, and that transition is early, by far the earliest in the European Union. In addition, there is low labor market attachment among those with chronic illnesses and among immigrants. And with immigrants, we don't mean recent immigrants, but it's also second generation and in some sense even third generation immigrants. That also explains why we spent quite some time on health and migration. Again, some facts. This is labor force participation in France, and it's lower in all these age ranges you see here than Italy, the European average, Germany, not to speak about Japan. And I regard this actually as the greatest challenge, a larger challenge than demography. Since the French also live very long, they have a higher life expectancy than most of the other countries. They go early into retirement, they stay there very long. That is, of course, a huge cost factor. If you compare these two numbers here, then you see on average, French men stay 4.5 years longer in retirement than the EU average. For women, it's not as much, but close to that as well. 4 years out of sort of on average 20 years in Europe, of course, makes a huge cost difference. Okay, so far the diagnosis. Now, what is the cure? And we decided to have a very holistic strategy for two reasons. First, simply for economic reasons, you have to think about more than just pension reform. But the other one is political. I think you all know what has happened about 1.5 years ago, almost 2 years by now, when they proposed changing the retirement age. People were on the streets, cars were burned. You could not reach the Arc de Triomphe, which is now covered. So there was a huge uprising in France. So you have to keep in mind that the art of pension reform in France is not only to do it economically right, but to also give something politically. We advocated fundamental pension reform to unify and simplify the confusing system. That by itself is a major reform because you have to transit all the 30-something different systems into a single one. And you will get flack from all the 30-something systems because they're like their own system. So what to do, what to give in exchange for that? Make the system more redistributive. Right now, it is more or less a linear system. We're very much earnings related to your lifetime earnings. We recommended to make it much more redistributive to protect the poor and the unhealthy. The other one, which we, rather than sort of prescribing a trajectory of retirement age and pension benefits, one getting longer, the other one getting more austere, we actually try to balance the two and give that balance to a political commission. That is something I don't like so much as an economist, but I think it's very important that the technocrats do not prescribe a rule how pensions will develop in the future. The other thing which we, of course, this is the holistic strategy, which we emphasize over and again. In addition to your pension reform, you need accompanying reforms. Labor market, improve the labor market for older workers, strengthen healthcare to support people with chronic illnesses, and better integrate the immigrants. A little bit on pension reform. So the new system is supposed to be a point system, a universal point system, universal because for all sectors, but a point system in the sense that 100 euros earned give you a point, and then if you earn more, it gives you more points. If you work longer, it gives you more points. The unpleasant fact, of course, is that if you have more pensioners, fewer contributors, you kind of give it to everyone. So what we try to do is really stress the redistribution and sell them. It's really political marketing. Sell them as two sides of a coin. There's one thing where we protect the poor. The other one is we do the, if you want, austerity measures for the richer ones. So we recommend to index smaller future benefit to the change of dependency ratio. This automatically, and this is done by a formula. So it automatically reacts to the demography. But the basic indexation goes from prices to wages. Again, you see, we give something and we take something away. We always try to do both at the same time. These are the two sides of a coin. We protect low earners by and even improve their position by giving bonus points. So the lower third gets extra points. We are in favor of a higher retirement, of course, if life expectancy increases further. But we also want to introduce a retirement window and stress that we don't want a fixed age, âge pivot in French, but rather give more flexibility. Now, a very important point in France is what's called pénibilité. the harshness of jobs. And we advocate that this is not addressed by the pension system per se, but by collective agreements. We sort of want to internalize the damage employers are done on the health of their employees. We want to internalize that. Okay. The important message is twofold. Given all these measures, it's still possible to keep and even increase the purchasing value of pension benefits. So the purchasing power of pension benefits will not decrease, but rather increase, but much slower than in the past. The second one is the choice between benefit increases and increase of the retirement age is left to a political commission dominated by the social partners. Okay, I think I will stop here. I think I have emphasized that pension reform needs to be a package of labor market action accompanied by healthcare, integration improvements. You have listened in the first two presentations, which Paul announced, how we strived in the Commission to generate more good jobs. And for the older people, which are interesting for our part, this means more flexibility, more part-time, and particularly more motivating jobs. France is on the lowest scale by far in terms of job satisfaction. And in our recommendation, we also address these issues. Okay, I'll stop here, make myself and give Carol the floor.
Thank you, Axel. I seem to have lost on my screen the slides, though. Could you put them back up again?
Okay.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Axel.
So here you are.
Thank you a lot. So I want to pick up, obviously, on the health part. And as Axel said, the French have a long average life expectancy. However, as in other countries, the growing life expectancy actually masks inequality in life expectancy across individuals. And depending a bit on which measure of ability to pay or wealth or education that you look at, there are differences that are as large as 10 years between those at the bottom of the life expectancy distribution and those at the top. And that's related to past events in people's lives, but also and their position and the type of work they've done. But it is also related to what you see in other countries as well, which is a rising tide of chronic illnesses. Illnesses that are not acute, but illnesses that individuals have over a long time. This is not unique to France at all. This is a similar pattern to other rich and indeed other developing countries as well. But then on top of that, there are, of course, inequalities in the incidence of chronic illness. That certain people who have lower income tend to have higher rates of chronic illness, particularly an association between lower income and lower education and multiple chronic illnesses. And this relates to the pension problem, that part of the reasons given for retirement and non-participation in the labour market is the presence of chronic illnesses which individuals state prevent them from working, and which employers do not like employing individuals with, particularly chronic illnesses like mental health. So that's the kind of backdrop to the kind of health part of this aging population. And that's to be set with the current French healthcare system. And the current French healthcare system is very much liked by their population. It's a generous healthcare system. The French spend more on healthcare than the British do, for example. But one of the features of the French healthcare system is it's extremely focused on curative medicine and on hospital-based treatments. They don't have as good a GP system as the UK has, or some other systems in the Nordic countries. And there's much less focus on prevention than there is on cure. On top of that, there's a very long-standing unequal distribution of healthcare resources, such that there are areas around the big cities and rural areas as well that have much poorer access, particularly to hospital care, but also to general practitioner care. And this is not a new problem. In fact, it's been referred to since the 19th century. Can I have the next slide, please, Axel? So what are our proposals? Now, we do not propose large-scale reform of the healthcare system. The Macron report is extremely wide-ranging. We've already proposed a major large-scale reform of the pension system. And the idea of the reforms that we proposed were reforms that would support individuals working longer, individuals in healthier lives. So what we do in the report is instead, we propose a narrower set of reforms that are intended to incentivize healthcare suppliers to focus on prevention and the treatment of chronic illnesses. On top of that, we wish to build on the reforms that have been introduced to the healthcare system in recent years. So those reforms essentially have sought to reduce the amount of fee-for-service in the French healthcare system, and to begin to introduce payments for quality, and to begin to focus more on prevention as well as acute care. So we seek to build on those reforms. We also recognize that chronic illness are not just the result of poor healthcare. Chronic illnesses arise from people's work positions, the environment they live in, the stresses they feel, and the consumptions they make. And of course, chronic illnesses are treated by the state by a number of methods. And indeed, all the research suggests that a number of methods is the best way of addressing long-standing chronic illnesses. So we acknowledge fully that the kind of reforms that we're suggesting are going to operate alongside things like bans on the consumption of hazardous goods, smoking bans, other kind of bans, the provision of information, the help to individuals to manage their own diseases, and indeed taxes, for example, sin taxes, such as taxes on sugar. So the reforms we propose are much narrower and are intended, as I say, to incentivize healthcare providers. Can I have the next slide, please, Axel? So the other thing that is the hallmark of the kind of reforms that we've stressed in the report are, first of all, reforms that emphasize experimentation. Again, experimentation has been introduced a little bit already in reforms in the French system. We think this is a very good idea, rather than putting in reforms all over the place, which are not tried and tested, to build on an evidence based with experimentation. We would counsel that for the NHS as well. And we also want to build on the lessons from COVID, in that the Macron report took place in 2020 when we were in the middle of a pandemic, which drove changes in healthcare and drove changes in healthcare provision in many countries, including France. So the four kind of points of the reforms that we want to look at is, first of all, we advocate relating payments to quality of treatment, so that payments should be not given just on a fee-for-service basis and not given on an input basis, but payments should be related to how much the patient improves. They should also be related to the prevention of chronic illness. So one of the measures of quality is how much chronic illnesses such as high blood pressure are treated, chronic illnesses such as diabetes are halted or even reversed. And we want payments to be related to that. That's very much a kind of NHS type model, and it's intended to incentivize providers to focus on outcomes. The second is the French system is very much dogged by payments for single items, as many fee-for-services are. We advocate bundling treatments because treatments for chronic illness often involve a number of providers, often in different settings. We believe the best way to incentivize that is to bundle payments rather than pay individuals for their time. So that's the second kind of plank of what we're thinking about. The third plank is that the French system is generous, but has co-insurance, or has co-payments. So people pay something upfront for their care, which they then can insure themselves against and get back after they've had the care. Now, this may be fine for individuals who are wealthy and have deep pockets, but we know that paying up front harms individuals who are poorer, even if they can claim it back later. So we want to have a basket of care for prevention, which is fully reimbursed up front. And the focus is that basket is not for cure, but for prevention activities. And they may vary what those prevention activities are, but they should be fully reimbursed at the point of use. Finally, to deal with the issue of general shortage of labor and provisions in various areas, we would like to hasten regulatory requirements and change the regulatory and financial incentives for telemedicine. Clearly, there are issues with telemedicine about who accesses or not, but it's been clear that telemedicine in many systems has increased access for individuals. And we would like to see one of the ways of dealing with the long-term problem of a dearth of resources, particularly a dearth of resources for people who are poorer and located in poorer areas, to have a speeding up of the use of telemedicine in the French system, which is currently very blocked by a large set of regulatory and financial requirements. And again, we would like those to focus, when we think about releasing those regulatory and financial incentives, to focus again on the delivery of chronic illness care, much of which can be delivered through telemedicine. Okay, I'll stop there and hand over to Claudia.
Yeah, hello, everybody. I will say a few sentences on the topic of immigration. That was part of the chapter on demographics, and that's why I really focus on integration, and within the broad field of integration on the question of how to enhance migrants' labor force participation. And like Carol and Axel, I start out with a diagnosis, and I brought this slide here where you can see it's almost wrong to talk about low labor force participation of immigrants, because it's really some groups that have a low labor force participation. So here you see the share of individuals that are out of the labor force, means unemployed and inactive individuals. And we can see that this is really a challenge for first generation non-European migrants, and especially for females. So in the second generation, it already the picture already looks better, even though you do have to take into account that the second generation is much younger than the natives within the age group of the 20 to 64-year-olds. Axel, next slide, please. Yeah, and when it comes to explaining this picture, it's really important to take into account the complexity of reasons responsible for this. So in the German debate, that's one I'm familiar with, I'm often startled by how strongly some groups emphasize the role of culture here and others emphasize the role of discrimination. And we think it's really a set of factors that are important. Maybe the most important factor is the shortage of transferable skills. That means the skills migrants have before they migrated and then can bring to the destination country. So low skill levels reflect selective immigration of low-skilled individuals, and that's especially pronounced among some groups, especially migrants from North Africa and France and Turks. Overqualification adds to this problem. This is, again, especially a challenge for female migrants. So no matter how you measure overqualification, whether you ask people whether they think what they do is below what they were trained for, or whether you just compare levels of education and occupation, we can see that overqualification is a big challenge. And another challenge is that these low skill levels are really transmitted within families to the second generation. And this transmission process is aggravated by the fact that the majority of children with a migration background visit the most disadvantaged schools. I will come back to this point later. Skills are not everything. There's also a shortage of what I call additional resources. So that means language skills and also social capital. So when we look at PIAC data, that's like the PISA for grown-ups, we see that even in France, where a large part of the immigrant population are native French speakers, there is a substantial migrant native gap in literary scores. This gap is higher in France than it is in the UK. The gaps that we see between natives and immigrants reflect also a shortage of social capital. So that means if you compare natives and immigrants who are really similar with respect to levels of education, to language skills, to family composition, they still differ in their labor force participation. And that partly reflects the fact that migrants lack the ties to native French who are knowledgeable about how to get a job, how to apply, where vacancies are. Axel, next slide, please. Since you saw that low labor force participation is a challenge, especially for female migrants, it's really important to also take into account the role of motivational factors. So what we very clearly see in the data is that when you look at employment rates of natives and of immigrants, only among those who are active on the labor market, the difference is not so large, but the difference is very large between natives and immigrants if you look at who is active in the labor market. And again, these gaps are especially high for females. They are still high in the second generation, so among those who were born in France. And this partly reflects motivational factors. That means many immigrant women, even those who were born in the country, who are not immigrants, but second generation, they are hesitant to join the labor force. And that can have different reasons. It can be anticipated discrimination, but there is evidence that gender norms really play an important role here. And gender norms reflect partly religiosity. So we see that religious women in general are more hesitant to join the labor force. That's not only a challenge for women, for Muslims, as many assume, but for religious female Christians as well. It also reflects low labor force participation rates in the countries of origin. And then finally, and very important, is ethnic and racial discrimination. So there are studies by now that compare the level of discrimination that immigrants face as evaluated, for instance, in audit studies where similar resumes are sent out to employers. And these comparative studies really show that discrimination is a big problem in France. As one author put it, employers in France can discriminate largely due to the absence of monitoring or measurement along these lines. And as I already mentioned, if migrants are aware that they are discriminated, especially women who wear a headscarf, for instance, that can really reduce the motivation to join the labor force. Axel, next slide, please. So when it comes to the proposals we worked on, it's really important to take these different reasons into account. We identified 3 starting points. One is to encourage and facilitate the, if only partial, recognition of existing skills migrants bring with them, and to make it easier for them to achieve the skills that are necessary after migration. So one very specific suggestion is to, or very concrete suggestion would be to welcome newcomers with a sort of signpost where they find very easily all the information. And that signpost should target low-skilled immigrants in particular, and maybe female immigrants in particular. So we did not tell this the French president, but Germany may be a good example here because of the welcome culture that they try to really implement when it comes to information that's open for recent immigrants. So I compared this. I did a little qualitative study looking at what new immigrants who are not very proficient in the language of the receiving country find on information on the internet when they search for language classes and so on. And there's really a big difference. So in France, this sort of information is available, but it's really mostly targeted on skilled immigrants and not so much on low-skilled immigrants, who are the ones who are face particular challenges. So there should be information on not only on language classes, but also on opportunities for skill recognition. It is very important to improve the access to language classes, including occupation-specific language classes, not only to make up for the shortage of language skills or language proficiency, but also to make up for to compensate the shortage of social capital. So there's a great study showing that why these language classes are really important and helpful for migrants, not so much because they improve their language skills, but because they really meet teachers and other students with whom they can exchange information on job vacancies, on how to apply. Next slide, please. Yeah, the most challenging proposal we came up with is the better mixing of schools. That's really key for not only for immigrant children, but for disadvantaged children in general. It's something that's very difficult to share, but nevertheless, states should try for improving this. So far, my impression was that the French strategy to improve the fact that immigrant children visit disadvantaged schools is to throw money at these disadvantaged schools. But what I think is also, or even more important, is to ensure that these schools are no longer that disadvantaged when it comes to the composition of the student body. So in France, private schools receive state support, and that would be a starting point for enhancing the pressure that the schools try for better mixing by social background, which would also imply a better mixing of children with and without migration background. That's not only important when it comes to labor market integration, but also when you think about the whole debate about radical Islam in France, about migrants living apart from the rest of society. That would be very important that kids mix and that schools are no longer as segregated as they are right now. And then finally, detecting and reducing discrimination is an important point. One thing that would be very easy to do would to capture ethnic background in the French census. This is not yet the case. So for the second generation, there's no information included on where the parents are from. We also suggest to implement a new panel study to better understand labor market disadvantage. And then finally, to improve the documentation about the ethnic representation in organizations and firms. This is what has been called building structures that establish a responsibility. And research shows that the French, those individuals who were born in France who have immigrant parents are not uneasy at all to provide this sort of information. So those were my proposals, and now I turn the part of the screen over to James.
Thank you, Claudia. I'll just set up the screen now. Hopefully you can all see that. So I've just got a few minutes to reflect on this from a UK perspective, really. And then I'll hand over to Lucinda, who's going to do the same. It's terrific to read this report, and it's really good to see people not just coming up with diagnoses of challenges and problems, but also, some quite radical solutions, and being ambitious with not just, a tax rate here and there or a taper, but actually, sort of restructuring of sort of fundamental institutions. And so it's great to see that. I mean, obviously, when coming from a UK perspective, I'm going to reflect more on the challenges and which challenges we share in common, rather than thinking more particularly about the cures that have been proposed in the nice talks that we've just seen. So I should say that the fundamental drivers of the challenges that arise from an aging population are the same everywhere. If we're going to live longer, then we better, it's much easier to deal with as a society if we can spend a higher proportion of our lives in paid work and a higher proportion of our lives with good health and functioning. So in that sense, of course, the starting point and the challenges that are set out in this report are very, very pertinent to the UK. But of course, we're in a slightly different position in France. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the pensions and the health issues from a UK perspective. And really, one might say that, we have our pension system is sort of under control in a financial sense, in the sense that the cost of the system going forward is manageable, since we've had a succession of pension reforms since the 1980s. And in fact, we don't even have any disincentives to work anymore in our pension system. I should say I'm only going to go very fast over these points. I could speak at length for each of them, but I'm just going to sort of put a flag in the ground for each one, and then we can come back to them in Q&A if necessary. But yes, we've sort of got rid of any disincentives to work in the pension system. So if you look at our employment rates, for example, at older ages in comparison to France, you can see that in the blue bars, in the late 50s, we have a slightly more, but basically comparable rate of paid work, for both men and women. But in the 60s, this is what Axel was talking about, the French participation rates dropped right off. Whereas in Britain, we have much higher participation rates, probably about twice as high participation in the 60 to 69-year-olds in the UK as in France. And that's basically the result of the French system and, the way that the UK system has reformed to gradually reduce disincentives to work at older ages. But as a consequence of that, of course, we have a different set of policy issues. And they are really around, if you've got a system where individuals are providing for themselves with a relatively low and affordable state pension, we've got a set of issues around pensioner poverty, about whether the universal pension is adequate, the public pension is adequate. We've got a set of issues around financial inequalities in later life. If people are saving for themselves, then financial inequalities can build up and up and up over the lifetime with less social insurance and less earnings replacement. And indeed, we've got a real set of issues that I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on this around inequalities in people's ability to work below the state pension age. So we've already been increasing our state pension age. As many of you will know, we're at 66 at the moment. We'll be at 67 within 5 or 6 years, and 68 within another 10 after that. And not only that, but we've already got a commitment to keep these increasing pension ages under review as life expectancy increases. The kind of political commission that Axel talked about here has already the Cridland Commission has already met, if you like, in the UK. But the consequence of that, as we push the state pension age up, is for those with poor health or ability to work, the gap between when they're able to continue work and the state pension age begins to increase, and we get that inequality essentially in working life below the state pension age. And so we have an important set of issues in policy really about how to support employment at older ages that are very much along the lines of what this commission in France has been discussing, how to retain and develop lifetime skills so older workers can maybe change jobs but still stay in the labour market, how to think about healthy jobs or flexible jobs, etc. And one of the things I think is very interesting, this idea in the Commission of the collective agreements and the role of employers of people who have arduous jobs. It's a rather grey area in the policy debate in the UK, but the balance, if you think you want more older workers and we need more age-friendly jobs, which I think most people would agree, the question is, how do we get that? What's the balance between essentially government intervention, employee or employer behaviour? And I think that's a really important question for how can we make the labour market more friendly for older workers with chronic conditions and disabilities who are arriving at that point below the state pension age. And as the state pension age rises, of course, there are more and more of those older workers. Just related to this, but actually more turning to Carol's comments, is that, targeting prevention or even just the delay of onset of chronic disease, I think you just want these diseases to come along later as opposed to earlier if you're thinking about differences between the poor and the rich. Is obviously going to be important in the UK as well. I mean, the NHS could do a lot more on prevention as opposed to treatment. But to add to that, in the UK, I would also add in the issue around occupational health and the sort of link between the health system and the employment system. So even, 10 years ago or 11 years ago, I was on the commission set up by the DWP, chaired by Dame Carol Black, to look at sickness absence from work. And we were talking even then about the fact that the NHS had basically stopped doing occupational health, and this link between essentially the services that you get from your GP and the kind of services that you needed to think about if you were either trying to stay in the same job or trying to stay in the labour market in different jobs was all really being eroded. And that was leading to sort of greater levels of sickness absence and ultimately health-related early retirements. So I think in the UK, there's this idea of how could we think about linking the health system and people's ability to work a little bit, targeting sort of health and preventative interventions, a little bit more about work-related abilities as well as just functional abilities more generally. And related to that, of course, we also have an issue for how to design and target disability benefits for the people who can't work before they reach the state pension age. And that might be other income support or disability benefit, but it's an important and very, very difficult issue. You want to have adequately generous benefits for those who really can't work without disincentivizing essentially the sort of more sort of shirking type behaviors, if you like, of people who could work. So there's a lot of issues around there, I think, that need to be sort of discussed when you're thinking about higher and higher state pension ages. But if I look at this report holistically, the one thing that strikes me is that it doesn't say anything about social care. The words social care are actually not mentioned in the report. And I think in the UK, certainly you couldn't think about the major demographic challenges without thinking about social care. And that's probably true in most countries around the world. I mean, the UK, we moved relatively early on pension reform in the 80s and 90s, and France has left it late. And arguably, with a lot of demographic issues, moving early is really important, because essentially it's easier to make reforms before the demographic pressures have really, really built up. So just to finish up, I've got a couple of pictures here. This is the standard dependency ratio that we really talk about, and Axel raised in the beginning in the UK. So that I've flipped it around. This is the number of working age people per 65-year-old, and you can see that even already in the last 10 years, it's fallen quite a lot, actually, by 1/7 from 3.6 to 3.1. And it's going to continue to fall from 3 to 2 over the next 50 years. This is actually slowing down. That sort of demographic bulge, if you like, the baby boomers are hitting 65 as we speak. So that's the sense in which France has already left it too late, really. But the consequences of that is they're now going into the older ages. And if I show you a different demographic dependency ratio, the proportion of people aged 80 and over, and I've even given some more people in the denominator here. So let's look at that as a ratio of the 20 to 69-year-olds. Let's assume that people are working till 70. You can see a much steeper decline in this, at least in terms of rates. So, between 2020 and 2050, we're going from 12 workers per 80-plus-year-old down to 5.6. That's more than half. And so what we're going to see coming up is this big increase in the number of 80-plus-year-olds, and that's going to drive a whole different set of pressures around social care that I think, if we're talking about things in the UK, we really need to embrace as one of the challenges of the ageing population. So really my final sentence is that I think, Axel spoke about the words, we need a holistic approach to the aging population, and I couldn't agree more. But I think, actually everywhere, not just in the UK, that holistic approach has to think jointly about pensions, about health and functioning. And I put health and functioning rather than just health, because I think disability, physical and mental health, cognition are all important dimensions. It's not just about chronic disease. So pensions, health and functioning, and social care really need to be thought about jointly, and the interdependencies between them. So on the financial side, if you have more liability in one aspect of the system, you might have less in the other, and vice versa. So it's really important to think about this. And I think when you think that, if you're thinking about social care, also there are other issues about immigration that can come into play in the UK context. We know, for example, that immigrants form a large fraction of the social care workforce, and indeed the health workforce. So it's not just about pure demography as well, it's about labour markets when you think about social care. With that, I'm going to hand over to Lucinda, and I think she's going to talk a bit more about immigration in particular, and then we'll come back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Yes, that gave me a nice lead in, your last point, to what I wanted to talk about. So like James, I'm going to be talking about this chapter in relation to the sort of UK perspective. And I am going to be focusing on the immigration section. And yes, it's worth thinking about when we're thinking about his observation on social care, that a lot of workers in social care in the UK are immigrant workers, and in healthcare as well, as he said. And while migration scholars are saying that it's not a solution, that immigration is not going to be a solution to the social care problem, and that's a very valid point, I think it does highlight that there is kind of a demand side aspect to immigrant integration and employment inequalities, as well as a supply side one. So that's going to be a theme that's going to, I think, run through my comments here. So this when I read this chapter, it was called the demography chapter. I was interested because early on in the report, it rather dismisses the proposition that actually immigration can change the demographic realities of France's population structure. And so this brings the focus here on immigrants largely to their employment circumstances, to their economic integration, if you like. And related to that, the extent to which they are part of the working population who can contribute to pensions, including their own pensions. But for me, this was not necessarily a demography issue per se, or even an integration issue per se. When there was a discussion of employment gaps, I was thinking about how far is it being a migrant that's driving these gaps and differences, or is this more generally about the opportunities and skills for particular sectors of the labour market? Is this rather a chapter 2 issue on employment inequalities, rather than a chapter 3 issue on the specific issues facing immigrants? Claudia presented a very clear case that there are very distinctive immigrant inequalities. But I think it's still worth stepping back a little bit and thinking about how much those are driven by the particular nature of the labour market, which workers it supports, which it doesn't, how much there is a low-skilled sector for immigrants, low-skilled immigrants to move into, and the extent to which the structure of the labour market facilitates the participation of higher-skilled immigrants. So on the one hand, we could think about things like recognising credentials. If we turn it around, we could think about why is it a society which is very much emphasising sort of the credential culture, which means that recognition process needs to be gone through in the first place. So I think there are some things to think about there in terms of, from the UK perspective, where we know that comparative analysis of the UK shows that the kind of more flexible labour market actually facilitates immigrant employment participation, even if they're not necessarily getting the best jobs, and even if there's still persistent discrimination. Claudia also highlighted that the heterogeneity of migrants' experiences in employment, and this, of course, is a heterogeneity that we see in the UK as well, that there are big differences both by country of origin and sex, and highlighting the fact that it's the non-EU women migrants who are particularly likely not to participate. And also that they don't necessarily catch up over time. And the catching up over time is an interesting issue, because I think there are probably two processes that are going on here, which might be solved if we had fuller longitudinal data for France. That on the one hand, there is a tendency to improve your economic circumstances over time as an immigrant. On the other hand, if you're in a disadvantaged labour market section, disadvantaged labour market position, this may actually cause you to detriments to your health, which means that you actually can't progress. So there's a sort of cumulative disadvantage process, which we see among some of the more disadvantaged immigrant workers in the UK. And I think it would be helpful to start to sort of disentangle that and think about, okay, so to what extent is this an immigrant issue again, or is it about the chronic health conditions faced by particular sections of the working population? There was also an interesting, I don't think Claudia would do it out, there was an interesting comment in the report that immigration policy can't change the composition of immigrants. And so these women with low participation are going to carry on because that's the way that immigration works and family immigration reunification works. I was interested by that because again, thinking from the UK perspective, we may not like or support what has happened in terms of immigration policy, but it has shown that you can shape who comes, particularly for non-EU migrants. So I think that's something that maybe there can be further discussion about. Is there a role for immigration policy here at all, if you're thinking about what fosters the best sort of situation in which to have a successful aging population in France. I just wanted to, I think I've probably said enough, almost said enough. I wanted to make two more points. One is about the educational transmission. I think there were some interesting suggestions and insights there into the role of schools. The discussion about educational transmission suggests that the low educational attainment and sort of the school segregation of children is linked to the low educational attainment of parents in large part, that there is this educational transmission. And I think what we see in the UK is this remarkable phenomenon whereby children of immigrants, even immigrants with very low skills, that they are doing very well in education. So the transmission isn't a necessary process, and perhaps it's again not the immigrants we should be looking at. Maybe rather than seeing that some sort of compensation needed for immigrant skills, we want to think about what can we do, what is holding back these children who should be attaining, if you use the UK as a comparator. What are the processes going on outside the family which are stopping that process? And the final point I want to make was, yes, I was very sympathetic to the call for more data. So from a UK perspective, I realise we're very rich in data that allows us much to disentangle in much more detail and much greater level of granularity some of these complex issues around cause and effect, around what's happening across immigrants' lives, how that interacts with their health status, their employment status, and also in relation to family transmission processes. So including sort of the issues of cultural transmission that were brought up. Is that about sort of cultural norms more widely that are somehow around in the community? Is it about the sort of the segregated areas in which people are living? Or is it about what people observe, what children observe? So is it that non-working mothers just transmit to their children that being a non-working mother is an okay thing? And how then and that might be something then that changes over time. How then do we intervene? But for all these sorts of questions, I think we do need better data, and I would fully support the attempt to get particularly immigration status, ethnic group, and be able to measure second generation in the census, and of course longitudinal resources. And I think if there was that greater collection of data, it would also pick up on this discrimination issue. So it was mentioned how there are quite high rates of discrimination in France. And I think without proper analysis and being able to understand these in a lot of detail, that it's, again, much harder to do anything about it. So I'll leave my comments there. I perhaps rattle through slightly fast, but I hope they raise some issues that can be addressed in the Q&A or that can be taken forward with the next stages of this report. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to all of you. That was just a fascinating run through an awful lot of things. We've got a number of questions in the Slido, but I'm actually going to abuse my position in the chair first, and I'm going to abuse it by asking Carol a question, I'm afraid. And in particular, Carol, you obviously kind of got fairly deep into the French health system in doing this. What can we learn from the French health system, if anything?
I don't, to be honest, the French health system is very popular, and it is partly popular because they spend a lot of money. And so to the extent that we're cash constrained, I think increasing expenditure on British healthcare to increase the popularity of the NHS, which I think it undoubtedly will, because it would bring down waiting lists and allow us to recruit more individuals, is perhaps not an option that's kind of open at present, or at least with the current kind of views about what taxes and benefits should be spent. So I think it's always difficult to learn from across different healthcare systems. I wouldn't actually take many things from the French healthcare system into the UK system because of its focus on curative and because of its fee-for-service strong elements. I would maybe look to other healthcare systems like perhaps the Dutch or the some elements of the German healthcare system rather than to the French. I don't mean to be rude to the people that are in France. And I do think that many of the reforms that the French are trying are reforms that the British have, indeed the NHS, and to some extent the Netherlands healthcare system have led the way in. Can I just say something about social care, because it's really important? There is, James, I mean, this report can't tackle everything, and there is currently a commission on social care that's in France. So we made the very explicit decision that that was one area that we couldn't tackle as well, given that there's a big commission happening on social care at present. But I totally take your point.
No, absolutely. But in some sense, are they separable? Can you?
Yeah, well, I totally take your point that they may or may not be separable, but the Macron report is already very wide-ranging. And I think, you know, as Axel says, these things have to be politically acceptable, and to tread on the toes of a social care reform panel that's very high profile might not be the most politically acceptable route to go.
No, but for a UK audience, we need to think of them as very much linked.
Agreed.
Well, I'll stop abusing my position now and actually go to some of the actual questions, and I'll do what I said by starting with the most popular one, maybe one for Axel and perhaps James. Given that there's a lot of variation of entry into age into retirement, out of the workforce, and actually also in terms of coming out of education, is the old age dependency ratio of the kind that you use, the sort of over 65s to the 60 to 64s or whatever, is that still actually a good measure, or should we be thinking about other measures as we go forward?
Yeah, there's actually a variety of old age dependencies. It's an entire industry to generate different old age dependency ratios. Now, considering the age range, actually it doesn't matter. It shifts the curve up or down, and unless you really start dependency at age 80, as James did in one of his slides, it doesn't change qualitatively very much. An interesting thing is to put like health measures in and disability weighted old age dependency. But then you confuse two issues. One issue is what is demography doing, what is labor market policy doing? What is health policy doing? And I think the beauty of the old-fashioned statistical old age dependency is to make clear that what demography does to a country.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I mean, I think that, we've said repeatedly through a lot of things at the IFS, at some level, the demography, it doesn't really matter whether people are old or young, it matters whether they're productive or unproductive. That's what a dependency ratio, or that's what the fundamentals that are driving the sort of economic pressures and the social pressures. But the sort of dependency ratio captures, if you like, just the pure potential for that, if you like. You could think of a world where everybody under 65 is working and nobody 65 is not working, and that that would be, it just captures that element over it. So it's not to say that what really matters, of course, is the ratio of productive to unproductive people. But I think, as Axel says, to the extent that the dependency ratio captures the pure demography, it's still, I think, an important issue. It's just an important summary, and we can present them all, but you have to pick one at some point, don't you?
Indeed, you do.
But I think where one thing is important to add, that a lot of dependency ratios used to be 16 to 64 on the denominator, and nobody, very, very few people leave school at 16 now. So we do have to think about the size of the working age. But if we're going to do it, we at least need to think about the right sort of sizes for the working age population. And as the retirement age goes up, we should make sure that we, if we're going to do the demographic dependency ratios, we should at least adjust them to be 20 to 69 or 20 to 67 or whatever.
There's a question, well, actually now two questions from Tom Schiller. I think the answer to your last question, Tom, about charts is they're all going to go up on the IFS website pretty much straight away after this. But there's a question that Tom put up 6 hours ago, according to Slido, which is about learning in later life and its effects on health and quality of life, which I think in some ways was also applied to previous one of these previous events where Danny Roderick in particular was talking very strongly about quality of work and quality of jobs, and that presumably played a role in thinking about aging as well in this commission. Again, I presume that Axel, you're best placed to answer this, but if anyone else would like to jump in, feel free.
Well, actually, if I had been James and commented on this report, I would not say that long-term care is essentially missing, but I would say in the pension plan and also on health, education was missing, because education obviously is crucial in both making people willing but also able to work longer. There's a very, very strong education gradient on the top of our professors who want to work forever. So improving education and it's absolutely crucial to increase labor force participation at older ages. And it's not only further education, which is sort of the obvious, but it's also basic education, which makes you more flexible and easy to change from one job to another, which actually carries you from a job which you can only have in relative youth to a job which you can later. I'm thinking about construction industry, for example. You can't work in the construction industry until 75, but you can switch at age 50 to another job, which first makes you healthier at age 65, and second gives you the ability to work longer.
Does anyone want to add to that?
I just wanted to add something about the kind of French situation that we do reflect in the report, though it's not a major part, which is that employers in France are differ a lot in their willingness to support workers who become unable to work or in their current jobs to switch or stay in new ones. And that's particularly a problem for individuals, not just with physical health problems, but with mental health problems. And I think that we're going to see a rise in mental health problems. The relationship between mental health and work is really important. And we stress in the report, we don't major on this at all, but we draw attention to a number of, if you like, best practice models that would be applicable, I think, in the UK case as well.
I'm going to go with probably the most difficult question on the list at the moment, which is about getting public buy-in to some of the things that you've all been talking about, and it's no easier in France than it is in the UK, and possible, and probably for pensions actually significantly harder. I mean, no doubt. I mean, I'd be very interested. You must have discussed this as part of the commission, that some of the reforms, particularly the reforms I guess Axel was talking about, but I presume any reform, and Carol, you talked about the popularity of the health French system, rather like the popularity of the NHS, which I think ministers are terrified to tangle with because it is so popular. And obviously there are big political issues here when one thinks about immigration and policy on immigrants as well. I just wonder whether we've got 4 minutes left. I wonder if each of you might like to reflect just briefly on how the sort of, the technocratic economist view of the world collides with political reality, and how we should deal with that. And sorry that I know that is an impossibly difficult question, but Axel is desperate to get off the mark. Fantastic.
Our attempt to actually tackle with that is do more redistribution. So this assumes that most of the resistance against pension reform comes from the lower third of the income distribution. Now, I'm not sure whether that assumption is right, but we decided to go that way. I tried this out in Germany and I failed because the most resistance against pension reform was from the middle of the income distribution. And it was very popular to redistribute from the poor to the middle and not talk about the rich. Now in France, I got advice from what else do? You speak to French people and have them advise you. And they actually claim that most of the resistance comes from the lower third of the income distribution. And the yellow vests are not the middle part of the income distribution, but really the lower part of the income distribution. Also, the resistance from the very right is more lower income than middle income. But that was our strategy, and it explains very much this two sides of a coin kind of proposal which we did.
I think,
Carol, any thoughts on health?
On health, I think we very much, because we felt that the pension reform was so important in the healthcare field, as I say, we steered well away from a kind of complete reform of the healthcare system and sought really to build on the really good foundations that there have been experiments and the direction of travel in France. And I think what we're trying to say here is the French need to speed up that direction of travel and overcome the resistance that they will have from the specialist hospitals and the more senior doctors groups. But, 'twas ever thus in healthcare reform. That is the kind of global, actually, problem in healthcare for reform, not just one to France. So, as I say, by stressing what's good about what's going on now and building on that, we hope to kind of, this is not too contentious.
Maybe just one sentence. So many of the suggestions from the immigration part are not very contested. I mean, who would object? Better data, more information on newcomers, more language classes. It's not even that expensive. I think the most challenging proposition is the better mixing of schools. And that's, of course, there's no easy answer, but maybe if it works, it could work in France, because I think in France there's quite a public awareness of the social costs of a strong segregation in society.
Okay, well, thank you all for that fantastic set of presentations. Again, for everyone listening, thank you for listening. And just a reminder, we have an equally, if not more, if I might say, star-studded event tomorrow at 3 o'clock as we launch some of the work from our from the Deaton Review of Inequalities, where we'll be looking at some of the ethical issues about why we worry about inequality, and quite a lot of work on attitudes towards inequality. Angus Deaton himself will be speaking at that, alongside Deborah Satz of Stanford, Stephanie Stancheva of Harvard, and Bobby Duffy of King's College. So a fantastic event to come tomorrow as well. You are all being spoiled by the IFS events team at the moment. But thank you so much to Axel, Carol, Claudia, James, and Lucinda today. Thank you very much.